Eleanor Whitfield had become extraordinarily accomplished at being invisible. It was, she had decided, a skill as worthy of cultivation as embroidery or pianoforte, and considerably more useful at a Mayfair ball where one's chief purpose was to not obstruct the view of one's elder sister. "Ellie, do step back," her mother murmured, her fan moving in short, anxious arcs. "You are blocking the light on Charlotte's hair." Ellie stepped back. She was rather good at that, too. From her new position beside a potted palm, she had grown intimately acquainted with the potted palms of London over the past 3 seasons. She watched Charlotte hold court at the center of Lady Ashworth's ballroom. Charlotte was genuinely beautiful, it must be said, the kind of beautiful that made men forget the middle of their sentences. Golden hair, a laugh like music, eyes that promised everything and delivered just enough to keep a gentleman hoping. Ellie's own hair was a quiet brown. Her eyes were a color she privately described as considering gray. She was not ugly, she knew that much, but beside Charlotte she registered as a smudge beside a painting, a rest between notes. The Ton had noticed Charlotte Whitfield at her very first ball 3 seasons prior, and had never quite recovered. They had noticed Ellie approximately never. She did not entirely mind. That was the complicated truth she kept folded up small inside her chest, like a note passed in church. She did not mind the invisibility itself. It gave her remarkable freedom to observe. What she minded in those quiet moments before sleep was the suspicion that she might remain invisible forever, that no one would ever look at her and see anything worth the looking. Her fingers itched. In her reticule she kept a small sketchbook and a stub of pencil, contraband at social occasions, and she was calculating whether she could remove it without her mother noticing when the room shifted. It was a physical thing, that shift, a change in the quality of attention, like a draft through a window, every head turning, every conversation pausing mid-syllable. Ellie looked toward the entrance. Alexander Vane, the Duke of Blackthorn, had arrived. She had seen him before, from distances such as this, and she had painted him once in her mind and several times on paper. Not his face, which she could not see clearly from a ballroom corner, but the impression of him, the way he occupied space differently from other men, as though he had decided some years ago that the world would arrange itself around him rather than the reverse. He was tall, dark-coated, carrying a scar along his jaw that society whispered came from Waterloo. He was 31. He was the most powerful peer below a royal duke. He had refused 4 heiresses, 2 viscounts' daughters, and 1 Italian countess of considerable beauty in the past 2 seasons alone. He was, by universal Ton consensus, entirely impossible. "Charlotte," her mother breathed, materializing at Ellie's elbow with the urgency of a general spotting an enemy flank. "Charlotte, look natural, natural, not like that, less teeth. Ah, he is looking this direction." He was not, as it turned out, looking at Charlotte. He was speaking to his host, Lord Ashworth, with the expression of a man calculating how quickly he might leave a party he had just entered. Charlotte dimpled and arranged herself beautifully. The Duke of Blackthorn did not notice. He collected a glass of wine he did not drink, spoke to no one he was not already speaking to, and declined 3 separate introductions with a politeness so crisp it might have been discourtesy in a lesser man.
"Hopeless," Charlotte said, appearing at Ellie's elbow, not at all diminished. Charlotte was constitutionally incapable of diminishment. "He's perfectly horrid. Mrs. Ferris says he has not danced once this entire season. Not once." She brightened. "I shall make him dance." "I imagine he will make himself not," Ellie said. Charlotte laughed and swept away, and Ellie returned to her palm tree, and the evening continued in its usual pattern of invisibility and small mercies, until it did not. He walked directly toward her. That was the impossible thing. Not a diagonal approach that might have been aimed at someone nearby, not a drift in her general direction. He walked directly toward Eleanor Whitfield, standing alone beside Lady Ashworth's unfortunate fern, with the purposeful geometry of a man who knows precisely where he is going. Ellie looked behind her. She did this genuinely, turning to check. There was a wall, only the wall. "Miss Whitfield," he said. His voice was lower than she had imagined it, in those idle moments she had most certainly never spent imagining it. "Your Grace," she managed. The courtesy was automatic, trained into her bones by a decade of her mother's drilling, and she was grateful for it because her mind had gone entirely blank. "I am Alexander Vane," he said, as though she might not know, and then, unexpectedly, something that might have been self-awareness crossed his face. "You know that. Forgive me. I have been making formal introductions for so long this evening I have begun performing them reflexively." This was so thoroughly human a thing to say that Ellie forgot to be alarmed. "I do know who you are," she agreed. "I confess I was not expecting to require the knowledge this particular evening." He looked at her. She had the distinct sensation of being examined, not in the way men sometimes looked at Charlotte, that cataloging of attractive attributes, but in the way she herself looked at a night sky or an interesting shadow, with genuine attention. "You were watching everyone," he said, "while everyone was watching your sister." Ellie felt warmth rise in her throat. "Is that a polite observation or an impolite one, Your Grace?" "I have not yet decided." He glanced across the room to where Charlotte was now applying her considerable charm to a young viscount. "She is very beautiful. She is. You do not say it with resentment." "Should I?" He considered her. "Most sisters would." "I am not most sisters," Ellie said, and then heard herself, and added more quietly, "I beg your pardon, that was impertinent." "It was accurate," he said, "and I find I prefer accuracy to manners this evening." He paused. "Most evenings." There was a moment, a strange, still moment in the middle of Lady Ashworth's very loud ball, in which Ellie could not think what to say, and did not try to fill the silence, and he did not fill it either, and somehow this was not awkward in the least. "You were sketching," he said. Her hand went involuntarily to her reticule. "I was not." "You were about to. Your fingers have been moving at intervals all evening." He nodded at her hand, and she looked down to discover she had, without realizing it, been tracing the outline of the window's shadow across her glove. "What were you drawing?" Ellie opened her mouth to deflect, to perform the pleasant, dismissive nothing that she had perfected for exactly these occasions, and instead, inexplicably, told him the truth. "The angle of the candlelight on the mirror arrangement, the way it fragments, it makes a pattern that reminds me of Cassiopeia." Something changed in his face. It was not a dramatic change, not the jaw-dropping shock of a man confronted with the miraculous, but something quieter, a door opening by a very small degree. "Cassiopeia," he said. "The W. 5 stars forming a W, yes, though in winter it tilts and looks rather more like an M depending on—" She stopped. "I am being tedious." "You are being nothing of the sort." His voice had lost its social chill. "Do you own a telescope, Miss Whitfield?" "I do not," she said. "I observe from my window with the naked eye, and a very good star atlas I found in my father's library. My mother considers it an eccentric habit, and has asked me to conduct it quietly." The corner of his mouth moved. "That is, I believe, the most relatable sentence I have heard this entire season." Ellie laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her, and she pressed her fingers briefly to her lips as though she might catch it. Across the room, she was dimly aware that her mother had noticed the Duke of Blackthorn speaking to her younger daughter, and had begun moving through the crowd with the speed and subtlety of a frigate under full sail. "My mother is coming," Ellie said. "I see her. She will redirect you to Charlotte within approximately 30 seconds. He looked at her with that same direct attention. "Then I had better say quickly, the Society for Celestial Observation holds an open viewing at my estate, Blackthorn Park, on the 23rd. I have the largest private collection of refracting telescopes in England." A pause, fractional. "The invitation is general, but I would consider it a particular favor if you attended."
Then Lady Whitfield arrived in a rustle of cerise silk, and the Duke of Blackthorn was at once again composed into his formal remoteness, and Charlotte was produced like a trump card, and Ellie stepped back to her accustomed position. But her fingers had stopped moving. She was not drawing shadows any more. She was holding the evening still. She went to Blackthorn Park. She went in the company of her mother, Charlotte, and young Mr. Fenwick, who was courting Charlotte without sufficient ardour to satisfy Lady Whitfield, but with sufficient persistence to be brought along as a supplementary admirer. The Society for Celestial Observation was a small and earnest group of gentlemen astronomers and their invited guests gathered on the south lawn of Blackthorn Park as the sun descended and the stars began their slow appearance. "Good heavens!" Charlotte murmured, and for once was not referring to a gentleman. The Duke appeared from inside, speaking to a man with a very enthusiastic moustache and a notebook, and spotted Ellie with a promptness that suggested, she told herself she was being foolish, that he had been watching for her. "Miss Whitfield." He greeted them all with impeccable equal courtesy, but he said her name first. "The Cassini refractor is set up near the rose garden. Jupiter's moons are visible tonight if the cloud holds." "Jupiter," Ellie breathed. Charlotte looked between them. Charlotte was perceptive in the way that beautiful people are often unexpectedly perceptive, attuned to shifts in attention the way a compass is attuned to north. She said nothing, which was itself a form of interest. What followed was the finest 3 hours of Eleanor Whitfield's 21 years of life.
He showed her Jupiter first, the disk of it, the banded clouds in ochre and cream, the 4 small stars that Galileo had first tracked 300 years ago, and which were in fact moons, each one a world in miniature. She looked through the eyepiece and made a sound she was not entirely prepared for, a small, involuntary sound of pure wonder, and heard him exhale beside her with something that might have been satisfaction. "There," he said quietly, "that is why." "Why what?" "Why one bothers with any of it." She straightened and found him closer than she had expected, watching her face rather than the telescope. She did not step back, neither did he. "My mother thinks astronomy is an eccentric hobby, for women especially." "My mother," he said, "thought many things. She was wrong with considerable regularity." His voice flattened briefly on the words, old pain pressed smooth by time. "She died 4 years ago. The grief was unexpectedly large. The confession was quiet and unadorned, offered without request for sympathy, and that was precisely why it moved her." "I am sorry," Ellie said. "I was in a dark season when it happened," he said. "Not grief alone. Waterloo had been the year before. I was not—" He paused, chose his words as carefully as if laying out instruments. "I was not at my best." "I remember the season of Waterloo," Ellie said. "London felt like a city holding its breath. It was not better inside it." She wanted to ask what had helped him through it. She did not ask because it would be too much, but he told her anyway, looking at the telescope rather than her face. "A painting someone sent me," he said, "anonymous, addressed to the Society, which forwarded it on. A watercolor of the night sky over the South Downs, Scorpius and Ophiuchus rising above a hill, in that particular deep blue that comes just before full dark. I have never been able to identify who sent it." Ellie's heart beat 3 very distinct beats. "It helped," he said, and looked at her then. "I cannot explain precisely how, but I looked at it when other things failed to reach me. There is an exactness to it. The stars are placed correctly, the colors are astronomically accurate, and yet it is also unmistakably felt. Whoever painted it was not simply rendering, they were seeing," Ellie said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "seeing." She said nothing. She could not quite. The painting was in her memory as clearly as a pressed flower. She had made it 2 years ago on a walking holiday with her father, sitting in a field with her watercolor box, watching Scorpius climb the summer sky. She had sent it to the Society on an impulse she had never entirely explained to herself. She had never told anyone. She did not tell him now. She was not yet certain she had the courage for it.
But he continued looking at her, and she continued not speaking, and somewhere in that particular silence, something between them shifted from careful to inevitable. They met 3 more times over the following fortnight, at a garden party in Grosvenor Square, her mother triumphantly positioning Charlotte beside him at the refreshments table, and the Duke of Blackthorn crossing the lawn instead to where Ellie sat under an oak tree with her sketchbook on her knees, open. She shut it hastily. He held out his hand. "May I?" They are only studies, very rough." He waited, hand extended, and she gave it up. He turned the pages slowly. Sketches of clouds, a doorway, a woman's profile half lost in shade, then a page of star maps, Ellie's own system of notation in pencil, the constellations annotated with the stories she loved best.
"This one," he said. He was pointing to Perseus. "Most people draw him holding the Gorgon's head aloft. You have drawn him looking down at it, with what appears to be, is that sorrow?" "He turned her to stone to save himself," Ellie said. "I have always thought he must have felt something about that afterward. Whatever she was before Poseidon cursed her, she was something." He handed the sketchbook back without comment, but he sat down on the grass beside her, on the grass, in his impeccable coat, and said, "Tell me the rest, the ones you have given different readings." She told him, and he listened, and she watched him listen, and the garden party continued around them without either of them noticing. At a musicale in Belgrave Square, she was seated in the back row, her mother had placed Charlotte in front, and he arrived late and took the only remaining seat, which was beside Ellie, and her mother's expression behind her fan was a complicated mixture of outrage and calculation. The music was Haydn, and it was beautifully played, and Ellie forgot about her mother and about everything else within 4 bars. She always lost herself in music. It was her other private country, alongside the sky. He was watching her again. She could feel it. At the interval he said, very low, "You were crying." "I was not," Ellie whispered. "Your eyelashes were wet. That is entirely different." "Is it?" His voice carried a warmth she had not heard from him in company. It was his private voice she had come to understand, the voice that existed below the ducal armor. "The adagio did the same to me. I do not generally admit it." "Why admit it to me, then?" "Because you already know," he said simply. "There is a freedom in that." She looked at her gloved hands. Her heart was doing something complicated and somewhat alarming. "Your Grace," she said carefully, my mother will—" "I know," he said, not unkindly. "She is watching with the intensity of a hawk that has spotted a field mouse of ducal proportions." The warmth again, edged with something rueful. "I am aware of how this appears. I want you to know that it appears accurately." Ellie did not breathe. "I will call on your father this week," he said, "if you have no objection. She could not find words proportionate to the occasion. "I believe, yes, I have no objection." "Good," he said, and then Charlotte appeared from the front row, beautiful and curious, and the interval ended, and Ellie spent the second half of the musicale, with Haydn moving through her like light through water, hardly hearing any of it. 3 days before his intended call, Lord Humphrey Carew came to dinner. Ellie had not been consulted on Lord Carew's invitation. Lord Carew was rich in a way that made other rich people feel insufficiently rich, and he was handsome in a way he was entirely aware of, and he had decided, with the confidence of a man to whom the word no was a temporary inconvenience, that he wanted Charlotte Whitfield. Charlotte did not want Lord Carew. Charlotte wanted, Ellie suspected, to be admired at her own pace and in her own terms, which Lord Carew had no particular interest in. But it was not Charlotte Lord Carew had come to trouble. It was Ellie he cornered in the library before dinner, and it was Ellie he looked at with that specific expression, the one that measured rather than saw, when he said, "You're the one Blackthorn has been making a spectacle of himself over, pursuing a wallflower. Cannot fathom it." Ellie set down her book. "I beg your pardon?" "No offense meant," he said, with the intonation of a man who meant considerable offense.
Only a man like Blackthorn, with his pick of the season's finest, dancing attendance on a girl who cannot get a single dance at a ball without her mother arranging it. He smiled pleasantly. One begins to wonder what you've offered him that the others have not. She was cold from her collar to her hem. I believe, she said, very quietly, that you should leave this room. Certainly. He was already at the door, unhurried. Do give my regards to your sister. I intend to speak to your father about Charlotte this week. It would be a shame if certain observations about your behavior with Blackthorn were to become general knowledge before then. Might complicate both your situations. The door closed behind him. Ellie stood alone in the library for a long time. Her hands were entirely steady, which surprised her. Inside her chest, something that had been slowly opening over the past fortnight closed very carefully back up. She would not tell the Duke. It was not his problem to solve. She was not his problem to solve. Whatever had been building between them, whatever accurate thing he had suggested at the musicale interval, she would not have it purchased with conflict on her behalf. She went down to dinner and was very quiet, and her mother told her she was blocking the light on Charlotte's hair, and Ellie moved over, and Lord Carew smiled across the table at her, and she looked at her plate. The Whitfields' musicale was her mother's great social ambition of the season. 6 months of planning, the finest musicians Lady Whitfield's budget could engage, every person of consequence invited, and a list personally curated to ensure that anyone who might overshadow Charlotte's position as hostess's daughter was placed in seats with obscured sightlines. The guest list ran to 40, the program to 2 hours, and the flowers alone had required 3 arguments with the florist and 1 with the greengrocer. Ellie's role was the usual, arranged in a back-row seat, instructed to applaud at appropriate intervals, and above all, do not do anything to attract attention, Ellie. Tonight is Charlotte's evening. She had not, in the days since Lord Carew's visit, spoken to the Duke. He had sent a note requesting the appointment with her father. She had not asked her father what had been discussed. She had been very busy, being very quiet. The evening began well. The musicians were excellent. Charlotte played the hostess with genuine warmth and skill, and their mother watched with the expression of a woman arriving at the exact destination she had always intended. Lord Carew was present, of course he was, and positioned himself near Charlotte with a proprietarial ease that made Charlotte's smile grow marginally fixed. Ellie sat in her appointed seat and watched, and tried not to look at the door. He arrived at 8:30, and her heart did what it had been doing for a fortnight. It forgot briefly what it was for, and had to be reminded. The Duke of Blackthorn found her immediately, through 40 people, across a decorated drawing-room, in her customary back row, and his expression did something complex that she could not read before he crossed to her with a directness that was becoming, she was realizing, characteristic. Miss Whitfield. He took the seat beside her, which was occupied by Mrs. Thornton's coat. Mrs. Thornton retrieved her coat with alacrity and found another seat. Your Grace. She was very composed. She had practiced composure all week. The program is about to begin. Your father tells me you have been unwell. My father is kind. I am perfectly well.
He looked at her with those eyes that had learned, apparently, to see past the things she arranged for viewing. You are not yourself, he said quietly. I am exactly myself, she said. I am just a quieter part of myself this evening. The program began, saving them both. The first movement was Schubert, and it was beautiful, and Ellie focused on the music with a concentration that was also a form of armor. Intermission arrived. She should have stayed in her seat. Instead, she slipped out to the hallway for air and solitude in the proportion of about 70 and 30%, and she had achieved approximately 2 minutes of both when Lord Carew appeared from the direction of the card-room. Miss Whitfield. He was holding a glass of wine, and the expression of a man who had made a decision. I've been thinking. I spoke rather harshly the other night. Allow me to apologize. She looked at him with the careful attention she had learned in 3 seasons of watching from corners. That is gracious of you, Lord Carew. It was poorly said, he agreed, moving closer. What I meant was,
A woman of your particular charms deserves better than being made into a curiosity. Blackthorn will tire of his little astronomy project, you know. Men like him always do. I do not require your assessment of men like him, she said. No, perhaps not. He was directly before her now. But you might require mine of your situation. Your sister has refused my most recent overture. His voice had gone flat. Privately, I might find it rather more so, for your whole family. Unless I persuade Charlotte to reconsider, Ellie said, not a question. Her voice was entirely level. You are cleverer than you appear, he smiled. I had heard you were invisible. I find you are merely quiet. He leaned slightly in. Convince Charlotte, or I shall have something very particular to say tomorrow at Almack's about the spectacle of a wallflower angling for a duke. Ellie? The voice came from the drawing-room doorway. One word, her name in the duke's voice, and Lord Carew straightened as though someone had pulled him by the collar. The Duke of Blackthorn stood in the doorway. He had heard. How much, she could not tell from his face. His face had gone somewhere very still and very cold, the way a sky does before a storm, when all the light collapses to a single white line at the horizon. Carew, he said. Carew executed an admirably steady bow. Blackthorn, we were merely— I know what you were, the Duke said. What happened next Eleanor remembered afterward in the way one remembers certain pieces of music, not note by note, but as a whole, felt rather than followed. The Duke crossed the hallway in 4 even strides and stood beside her, and she had the sudden, overwhelming sensation of gravity rearranging itself, of the room orienting around a different center. You will go back inside, he said to Carew, with the perfectly pleasant tone of a man who is accustomed to being obeyed, and you will collect your hat and your coat and leave this house. You will not speak to Miss Whitfield or Miss Charlotte Whitfield or any member of this family in any public venue or private correspondence from this moment forward. Carew's color had done something interesting. You cannot—
I can, the Duke said. I have, until this moment, allowed you your shipping interests because they were of no concern to me. I own, as it happens, a 43% stake in the Consolidated Maritime Exchange. 43% is not a controlling interest. He paused, and the pause had texture, like the moment before thunder. But it is sufficient to make the other 57% very uncomfortable if I choose. And I would choose, Carew, with considerable enthusiasm if you give me reason. The silence in the hallway was total. Furthermore, the Duke continued, with the unhurried confidence of a man laying cards he has already counted, I am aware of the debt you carry with Halcourt Bank, your late father's debt which transferred, and Halcourt's primary backer is, by some coincidence, a man who has dinner with me on the 3rd Thursday of every month. I have never mentioned you to him. I would not be obliged to continue that omission. Lord Carew set down his wine-glass. His hand was not, Ellie noticed, entirely steady. This, the Duke said, is what happens when a man of no particular consequence decides to threaten a woman of every particular consequence. You will go. Lord Carew went. The hallway was very quiet. Ellie became gradually aware that she was not breathing in a fully functional way, and attempted to correct this. Are you— the Duke began. I am perfectly well, she said, which was not entirely true. She was perfectly several things, none of which she had adequate vocabulary for. You did not need to— I know I did not need to, he said. I wanted to. There is a distinction. He turned to face her fully, and his voice dropped out of its ducal register entirely. Ellie. The name arrived without the miss for the first time, and it landed in the middle of her chest like a key in a lock. I went to speak to your father 3 days ago and found you suddenly very occupied with being elsewhere. I spent 3 days telling myself not to press, that you might have reasons, that you would speak if you wished to. He exhaled.
Then I saw Carewe's face when he was speaking to you. I did not want you involved on my account, she said. And I, he said, have been involved on your account since a watercolor painting arrived at my estate 2 years ago in an unmarked envelope. She was very still. I knew, he said quietly. Not immediately. I recognized the star placement first, the accuracy of it. And then I remembered watching you trace the shadow at Ashworth's ball, and I thought about the painting, and I knew, or suspected, strongly. His voice was careful and honest. I could not approach you about it without making you feel surveilled, and I found I was afraid that if I asked too directly, I would frighten something that I very much wished to stay. Ellie felt the careful closed thing in her chest creak, open further. It helped me, he said, the painting. I was in grief, and he paused, and she understood now that the next word cost him. Broken, in some of the ways that war breaks men that don't show in the body. I looked at that painting, the rightness of those stars, the blue of it, the feeling in it, and I thought, someone made this who knows what it is to look up, who finds the sky sufficient, who sees. He looked at her directly. I wanted very much to find that person. You found me, she said, and her voice was not entirely steady.
I found you, he agreed, and you are the most genuinely interesting person I have encountered in any season I have lived through, and I am aware that is not the conventional declaration, but I find I am not a very conventional man, and I believe, Miss Whitfield, that you are not a very conventional woman, and that between us we might manage something rather better than convention. From inside the drawing-room came the sounds of the second half resuming, violins finding their opening phrase, guests settling into chairs, her mother's voice doing its social occasion lifting. In a moment they would be missed, in a moment the evening would require them. I am going to ask your father, he said, if you are willing. I am going to ask him quite formally, and then I am going to be very impatient until he answers, which I expect will be alarming for everyone involved. Ellie laughed. It was the real laugh again, the one she couldn't quite catch in time. Her eyes were doing the thing they had done at the Adagio, the wet eyelashes thing, and she did not try to hide it. Yes, she said, I am willing. Good, he said. The painting is of Scorpius rising over the South Downs, she said, and I painted it on a Tuesday in August because my father had been reading me Ptolemy, and I was thinking about how long those stars had been called by those names, and I thought whoever most needed that continuity ought to have it. I needed it, he said, precisely. I know, she said. I think I always knew someone would. He held out his hand, and she placed hers in it, and they stood in her mother's hallway while Schubert played in the next room, and the season continued outside without them, and for the first time in 3 years of London balls and potted palms, and stepping back and fading out, and being told to let her sister shine, Eleanor Whitfield was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her father said yes within approximately 40 seconds of being asked, which suggested he had been anticipating the question. Her mother said yes in a longer speech that involved the word Duke 14 times and the word Eleanor 3 times, 2 of which were corrected to Charlotte before being recorrected, after which her mother sat down and fanned herself with great feeling. Charlotte said, finally, someone with sense, and kissed Ellie's cheek and whispered in her ear, I saw him watching you at Ashworth's. I have been waiting to see if you would notice. Then she swept away to manage Mr. Fenwick, who had apparently been improving in ardour and did not look back. The Duke of Blackthorn, Alexander, she was learning to call him in her private mind, working up to it in public increments, proposed in her father's library on a Thursday afternoon in June, which was not a particularly romantic setting, except that the window faced east and the light was the particular gold of early summer, and he went down on one knee on the Turkish carpet with the expression of a man who had decided to do this correctly or not at all.
"I cannot," he said, "promise you a very easy life. I am not easy company. I keep irregular hours and unreasonable telescope schedules, and I am told I am cold in company, which I do not dispute, though I hope I have been less cold with you." "I have been," she confirmed. "I can promise you, the observatory is yours as much as it is mine, and more, perhaps, because you see things in the sky that I have missed, and I find I want very much to see them alongside you. I can promise you," he paused, "a husband who will never ask you to step back, who has, in fact, been watching from corners of his own long enough to understand something of what it costs." She considered this. What corners?
"They are perhaps less obviously positioned than yours," he allowed. "When one is a duke, the corners are in plain sight, and people pretend not to see them anyway." She understood this, she realized. She understood it precisely. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, and I will paint you Cassiopeia for the observatory in the correct winter orientation." "The M rather than the W," he said. "Yes." She was smiling so widely it was almost uncomfortable. "The M." He rose from his knee and took both her hands, and the gold light moved across the library floor, and her father's clock ticked its small, reliable ticks, and Miss Eleanor Whitfield, who had been told all her life to sit quietly and let her sister shine, was radiant in the afternoon of a perfectly ordinary Thursday in June. The observatory dome was open to the night. A year had changed Blackthorn Park in small, specific ways that the Duke catalogued with the quiet pleasure of a man who has learned to notice. There was a work table in the observatory now, set to one side beneath a north-facing window, her work table, with its jars of color and its careful brushes and its stacks of watercolor paper bearing maps of the sky in every season. There was a second eyepiece fitted to the Cassini refractor, because she had pointed out, with the excellent logic that characterized her, that they ought to be able to look at the same thing at the same time. The domed ceiling, which had been plain plaster when he had inherited it, now bore a painting of the northern sky executed in deep Prussian blue and soft silver, and the stars were placed with absolute accuracy, and the feeling in it was the same feeling as the painting that had arrived 2 years ago in an unmarked envelope, the feeling of someone looking up and finding it sufficient. She was at the refractor now, her eye to the lens, one hand making small notes on the paper beside her without looking at what she wrote. "Jupiter again?" he asked. He was in the armchair she had brought upstairs from the yellow parlor with the assistance of 2 footmen and without consulting him, which he had found he did not mind in the least. "Saturn," she said. "The rings are extraordinary tonight. Come and look." He came and looked. She was correct. The rings were extraordinary, tilted just so, the Cassini division a dark thread dividing the bright bands, the whole thing impossibly real against the black. "Extraordinary," he agreed. She straightened. Her hair was undone for the night, pinned loosely over one shoulder, and she was wearing his old observatory coat over her dressing gown because the summer nights still carried a chill, and she had appropriated it so gradually and so completely that he could no longer quite remember a time when it had belonged only to him. "I had a letter from Charlotte." "And?" "She says Mr. Fenwick has finally applied sufficient ardor. They are engaged." She smiled with genuine warmth. "She says she will not compete with the Duchess for social precedence, which she considers a great relief, as it means she can be as improper as she likes at parties." "That sounds like your sister." "It is precisely like my sister." She leaned back against his shoulder, looking up through the dome's opening at the dark. He rested his chin lightly on her hair. They had found this posture very quickly in the early weeks of their marriage, as though they had each been holding a space exactly this shape for some time. "I have decided on a name for the painting I am making of Scorpius, if you want to hear it." "Tell me."
The Sky Over the South Downs for Someone Who Needed It. A pause. It is a long title. It is a precise title. I prefer precise.
She turned her head slightly. In the observatory's soft darkness, her eyes were the color of the sky just before full dark. That particular deep gray blue that was not quite either. That was its own thing. He had tried to name the color of it for months, and had recently concluded that it named itself. "You needed it," she said. "I know that now. I think I knew it then, and I thought, whoever is up at this hour, watching Scorpius, in the quiet that is its own kind of grief, they should have this. They should know someone else is watching." "I know," he said. "And now we are watching together." "Yes," he said. "Now we are watching together." Above them, Saturn turned in its rings. The stars held their ancient positions, patient and exact. Down in the house, things were warm and well-ordered in the way that takes a year to build and a lifetime to sustain. Tomorrow there would be correspondence, and estate matters, and her mother's impending visit, and the small, ordinary machinery of a life. But tonight the dome was open, and the sky was clear, and Eleanor Whitfield, Eleanor Vane, Duchess of Blackthorn, painter of stars, the woman the Tun had told to fade into the shadows, leaned back against her husband in the dark and looked up, and found it, as she had always found it, exactly sufficient. More than sufficient. More than she had ever, in any corner of any ballroom, let herself imagine. The stars were the same stars they had always been. She simply had, at last, someone beside her to see them.
She had spent 3 seasons becoming invisible. He had spent 2 years looking for the woman who painted stars.